The autumn sun was bleeding gold across the suburbs when Karen first saw Mark's Tesla charging in his driveway. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, as an opportunity. Her old Nissan Leaf, purchased 5 years ago when the government was throwing tax credits at everyone, was barely holding 30% charge these days. The battery degradation had been a slow, inevitable betrayal. She'd read the articles. It wasn't her fault that the technology was obsolete. That afternoon, she'd driven to the mall, made it 3 miles back toward her neighborhood, and watched the charge meter plummet from 17% to 8%. The panic was familiar now, almost routine. She'd gotten good at managing the anxiety, at planning her routes like a chess player 6 moves ahead. But today she hadn't planned ahead. Today she'd taken a detour. Today she'd been stupid. She was sitting in her car 2 blocks from her house when she made the decision. Mark Chen was watering his front lawn when she pulled into his driveway. She'd lived 2 streets over for 3 years and had spoken to him maybe 4 times. Once about a package that was delivered to his address by mistake. Once about his tree dropping leaves into her gutters. Once at a community association meeting where she'd suggested raising the aesthetic requirements for the neighborhood. They weren't friends. They weren't even friendly. But they lived in the same subdivision, and that, in Karen's mind, meant they were part of the same social contract. "Hey," she called, rolling down her window. Mark looked up from his lawn work, squinting against the afternoon light. He was in his late 40s, she guessed, with dark hair graying at the temples and the kind of casual confidence that came from not worrying too much about what people thought. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, and he had the kind of focused expression on his face that suggested he'd rather be doing literally anything else than have this conversation. "Hi, Karen," he said, already turning back to his watering. "I need a favor," she said, no preamble. No "how are you?" No relationship building. Just the ask, direct and clean, the way she made requests of customer service representatives and her teenage children. Mark continued watering, his posture stiffening almost imperceptibly. He was a software engineer, she remembered now, worked from home most days. Probably had no appreciation for the value of social convenience and reciprocal favors the way people in business did. He'd probably think this was transactional rather than what it really was, a simple ask from a neighbor. "My car's running low on charge," she continued, not waiting for encouragement. "I'm stuck. My house is 2 blocks away and I won't make it. Your charger is faster than mine. I just need to plug in for 20 minutes. Mark turned off the hose and looked at her directly for the first time. His expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was the expression of a man calculating whether it was worth the effort to say no, weighing the social cost against his own convenience. "I'm not sure that's a great idea," he said finally. "Why not?" Karen's voice had already shifted, taking on that sharp edge it got when she was preparing for confrontation. "It's just electricity. It's not like you're out anything." "That's not really," Mark started, but Karen was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "I'm literally out of power," she said, opening her car door. "My battery is dying. I live 2 blocks away. This is a 5-minute conversation we shouldn't be having. You seem like a reasonable person, Mark." That last sentence was a pressure point, and they both knew it. Reasonable people helped neighbors. Reasonable people weren't selfish. Reasonable people understood the small ways a community functioned. She was reframing his hesitation as unreasonableness, and they both knew that too. Mark was quiet for a long moment. He was the type who thought before he spoke, who didn't just react. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the effort required to hold his boundary against the social pressure she was applying. "The charger's in my garage," he said finally. "It's a level 2 charger. Your car has the adapter." Relief flooded through her. This was the moment when she'd already won, when the details had surrendered to her will. "I have it," she said quickly, moving toward her car. "Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver, literally. I've been so stressed about this all week." Mark handed her the key code to his garage without saying anything else. His shoulders had the rigid set of someone who had made a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with and was already regretting it. Karen told herself this was just being helpful. This was just community. This was just what neighbors did. The charger was in his garage, exactly where he'd said it would be. She pulled her car around, plugged in, and watched the LED on the charging port blink green. 35 minutes, the app estimated. That would give her enough juice to get home and charge overnight. She texted her husband, "Stuck at Mark's place with car charging, back in 40. He didn't respond. He was probably in a video call or focused on work. He'd stopped responding to her immediate needs somewhere around year 7 of their marriage, around the time she'd stopped asking. While she waited, she did what she always did while waiting, scrolled through her phone. There was a news story about the latest research on EV battery degradation, which she skimmed with the grim satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been vindicated by science. There was a post from the community Facebook group about someone's solar panels getting damaged in the recent windstorm, which was tragic but hardly her problem. There was a notification that her credit card statement was ready, which she quickly swiped away. By minute 30, her car was at 68%. Enough to get home, more than enough actually. She could unplug now and be fine. Instead, she stayed. The numbers clicked upward, 70%, 75%. She had already asked. She had already imposed. What was 10 more minutes when she was already here? What was the harm in getting to 80? Mark came to the garage door around minute 42. He had a beer in his hand, and he looked tired in the way that suggested he'd had a long work day followed by the yard work, and now this unwanted conversation. "You're still charging?" he asked. "Almost done," Karen said brightly. 80% should be perfect." "The charger charges pretty quick," Mark said. He was standing in the garage door, not coming in, maintaining the distance. "Level 2, I mean, it gets to 80 pretty fast, but 80 to 100 takes forever. The taper is brutal." "I know how it works," Karen said with a slight edge to her voice. "My car charges." Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, well, you should probably unhook soon since you've got what you need." There was a finality to his tone that triggered something defensive in Karen. He was being hostile. He was making her feel unwelcome for asking a simple favor. He was being the exact kind of person who would refuse to help a neighbor in need, and then when she was stuck on the side of the road with no charge, he'd judge her for it. "I'll go when I'm ready," she said. Mark took a drink of his beer and looked at the charger, at the car, at her face. Something crossed his expression. Resignation, maybe, or the deep tiredness of someone who had spent too much of his life managing other people's expectations. "Let me know when you're leaving," he said. "I'll want to lock the garage." He went back inside without waiting for a response. Karen sat in her car for another 8 minutes. The charge hit 90% at the 3-hour mark. She could have unplugged then. She could have unplugged at 85 or 80. But the principle of the thing that Mark had tried to make her feel rushed, had made her feel like she wasn't welcome, had suggested through his tone and his body language that she was imposing. That principle made her stay. She would use the charger as long as she wanted. It was just electricity. It wasn't like he was out anything. When she finally unplugged at 92%, the sun was lower on the horizon and the temperature was dropping. She knocked on his door to return the key code and caught him in the middle of making dinner. His wife, Sarah, was sitting at the kitchen counter with a glass of wine, and they had been having a conversation. She could tell from the way their posture changed when she appeared in the doorway. "All set," Karen said, handing over the code. "Thanks again, you're a good neighbor." Mark didn't smile back. He just nodded and closed the door. She didn't see the exchange between him and Sarah through the kitchen window. She didn't see him explain what had happened. She didn't see Sarah's expression shift from wine-induced relaxation to something sharper and more alert. She didn't hear Sarah ask, "How long was she here?" or hear Mark's response, "Almost 3 hours." Karen drove home, her battery fully charged and her resentment fully stoked. She'd done nothing wrong. She'd asked a favor and received it. If Mark wanted to be hostile about it, if he wanted to make her feel like she wasn't welcome, that was his problem. She'd show him next time. She didn't need his charity. She didn't need anything from him. The thing about certainty is that it's very easy to maintain when you never examine the other side of the argument. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, Karen's car battery continued its inexorable decline. She'd had it tested at the dealership, $89 for the diagnostic, another $2,400 they estimated to replace the entire battery pack. Not covered under the extended warranty because the extended warranty only covered manufacturing defects, and a 5-year-old battery showing normal degradation apparently didn't qualify. She'd looked into federal credits for a replacement vehicle. Apparently, those didn't apply to used EV purchases, only to new ones purchased directly from dealerships. She was, it seemed, in exactly the gap where no safety net existed. She began charging at home overnight and budgeting her driving accordingly. It was an inconvenience, but manageable. The real problem was that she'd gotten used to the idea that Mark's charger existed. It had become, in her mind, a resource that was available to her. More than that, it had become a symbol of his refusal to be a proper neighbor, his rejection of what she perceived as basic community obligation. When her cousin visited from out of state, Karen found herself recounting the charging incident like a story of injustice. "He was so hostile about it," she'd said, which wasn't technically untrue, though it was also somewhat imaginatively exaggerated. "Like I was asking for his kidney, not just a few dollars worth of electricity." Her cousin had nodded sympathetically, which had reinforced Karen's narrative. The incident had, in the retelling, become less about her needs and more about Mark's deficiency as a human being. The second time she asked was on a Saturday. She'd driven to a farmer's market in the adjacent town, excited to go, not really thinking about her charge. By the time she was leaving, the wind was gusting and the charge was at 22%. She'd checked the map. Her house was 14.8 miles away. Her car would make it to maybe 8 miles. She could stop and charge at the supermarket, wait an hour, but that seemed excessive. Why wait an hour when her neighbor had a fast charger that would top her up in 30 minutes? She told herself she was being rational, efficient. She told herself that Mark had offered to help once, and that meant he was the type of person who helped, and that meant asking again wasn't imposing, it was just being part of a network of mutual aid. She told herself a lot of things that morning. Mark answered the door in gym clothes, clearly having just finished a workout. She could see the small tension in his jaw even before she opened her mouth. He already knew what she was going to ask. You could see it in the way his face had closed off, the way his hand had tightened on the door. "I need a favor," she said. "Again, my car." "Karen," he said, gently cutting her off. "I appreciate that you're in a difficult situation, but I can't keep charging your car. The charger is expensive to operate and the wear and tear." "It's just electricity," she interrupted. "You're not out anything." "I am, though," Mark said. "Electricity costs money. Charger wear is a real thing, and more than that." He paused, seeming to search for words. "This isn't sustainable. If I let you do this regularly, other neighbors are going to ask. It becomes a liability issue. It becomes complicated." Karen felt something sharp rise up in her chest. Rejection, boundary setting, the refusal to perform the role she'd assigned to him. "So you're just going to let me strand myself?" she said. "That's very neighborly of you." "There are other options," Mark said, his voice patient in a way that made Karen want to scream. "There's a charging station at the strip mall 2 miles away. There's a public charger at the library. There are other solutions that don't involve." "That would require me to leave my car for hours," Karen said. "While you have a charger right here, you're choosing to be difficult about this." Mark took a breath. She could see him pulling together his patience like a fraying rope. "I'm not choosing to be difficult," he said. "I'm setting a boundary. I'm saying no. That's allowed, Karen. It's okay for me to say no." "Fine," she said, her voice sharp as glass. "I'll go to the strip mall, but don't come complaining to me when I'm late picking up my kids or when I have to run them around all afternoon because I'm stuck waiting for a charger. Don't come complaining when you see me broken down on the side of the road because my battery died. This is on you." She turned and walked back to her car before he could respond. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, breathing hard, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't going to the strip mall. That would cost her money. That would be admitting the problem was real and her responsibility. Instead, she'd drive home slowly, keep her speed down to conserve energy, and hope the battery lasted. She made it 11.3 miles before the car started showing her the low battery warning in earnest. She was on a highway with commercial zones, nothing residential, no public chargers. She had to pull over and call her husband to come pick her up. She had to sit on the side of the road for 40 minutes while he drove from home and retrieved her and the car. She had to explain to her teenage daughter why her weekend plans were disrupted, because they had to figure out what to do about the stranded vehicle. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and her laptop, looking up Mark Chen on Facebook. She read through his profile with the methodical focus of someone gathering evidence. There were photos of him and Sarah on vacation in Costa Rica, photos of them at some kind of tech conference, photos of them at neighborhood events, smiling, looking rich and comfortable. They didn't have kids. It was probably easy to be generous when you didn't have the constant financial pressure of raising a family. It was probably easy to set boundaries when you didn't have the real struggles that other people had. She told herself this was why Mark had said no, not because his boundary was legitimate, not because her request was unreasonable, but because he was lucky and she wasn't, and he was choosing to keep his luck to himself. Over the next month, Karen charged at home and budgeted her driving strictly. She started resenting the habit of seeing Mark's Tesla in the driveway, gleaming and well-maintained, while her own car was slowly dying under her. She started resenting the way Mark would occasionally wave at her from his house, trying to maintain some sort of neighborly facade despite having betrayed her. She started resenting that she had to ask for help and had been refused. And then in October, she saw an advertisement on her phone for a new energy company that was offering reduced rates for EV charging. The ad showed a woman like her, harried and frazzled, solving her problems by switching to a new provider. She clicked through and signed up immediately, hopeful that this might be the solution. It wasn't. The rates were slightly better, but not enough to change her fundamental situation. She was still trapped. By late October, when she asked Mark again, this time with a story about a doctor's appointment, about how her daughter had hurt her ankle and needed to get to urgent care, Mark's refusal was even firmer. He offered to drive her himself if it was truly an emergency. He emphasized the charging station options. He was kind about it, which somehow made it worse. Kindness felt like pity. Pity felt like judgment. She said she didn't need his charity and walked back to her car. But she was always thinking about that charger, about the fact that it was right there, sitting in his garage, doing nothing most of the time, about the fact that he could afford the wear and tear but chose not to help, about the fact that he had options and choices and safety nets while she was scrambling to keep her life together. Resentment, Karen was learning, was a lot like compound interest. It started small and grew exponentially. November arrived with crisp temperatures and the particular anxiety that comes to EV owners as the weather turns colder. Cold reduced battery efficiency by up to 20%, which meant Karen's already insufficient battery became practically unusable. A drive that would get her 50 miles in August now got her barely 40. She was starting to understand, with the clarity that comes too late, that she'd made a serious mistake buying an EV with such poor battery health. She started researching battery replacement costs obsessively. The official dealership option was still $2,400, which she didn't have. There were aftermarket options online from companies she'd never heard of, advertising batteries for half that price, though the reviews were mixed and the shipping alone was $400. There were Facebook groups of EV owners discussing their own battery degradation, and the comments section was a chorus of financial desperation and clever workarounds that ranged from the reasonable to the absurd. One night, while scrolling through these discussions at 11 p.m., Karen found a thread about public chargers and extended charging. There were people discussing ways to keep chargers occupied longer, methods of accidentally blocking chargers so that you got to use them without paying, tricks for disconnecting and reconnecting to reset billing. The thread was framed as people doing what they had to do to survive, and nobody was really condemning them for it. Karen's mind, exhausted and desperate, latched onto something in that thread. Someone had mentioned that if you owned a charger on your property and it was connected to a smart home system, the billing could be managed through an app. If you were smart about it, if you knew what you were doing, you could theoretically set the billing to your own account without the charger's owner knowing. She stared at that comment for a long time. She didn't do it. But the fact that she could have, the fact that it was technically possible, shifted something in her thinking. The boundary between what was Mark's and what was fair game had begun to blur. 2 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, Karen was driving back from picking up her youngest from school when her battery hit critical. She was 2 miles from her house. 2 miles. Her daughter was asking why they were slowing down, why they weren't going any faster, and Karen heard herself snapping at her in a way she hadn't snapped at her kids in months. She pulled into Mark's driveway without thinking about it first, without a plan. Pure action born from desperation and the knowledge that she was going to have this conversation eventually anyway. Mark came to the door looking wary. She'd become a known quantity now, the neighbor with the dying battery and the persistent need. He probably had a whole framework for managing their interactions. "I need to charge," she said. "No, can I? No, would you? No, do you mind?" Just the statement, direct and firm. "My daughter is in the car. I'm not leaving until the battery is at 70%, which is probably 20 minutes with your charger." Mark stepped outside, closing the door behind him. They stood in his driveway in the late afternoon light, and for the first time, she saw something like anger on his face. "No," he said clearly. "No, Karen, this needs to stop." My daughter is in the car, she repeated, as though this fact gave her the right to demand whatever she wanted. Then you need to drive carefully to the charging station, or you need to call someone for a ride, Mark said. What you don't get to do is use me as your backup plan every time you didn't plan ahead. I didn't plan ahead. Karen felt something volcanic building inside her. My car is dying, Mark. I'm doing the best I can. I'm a single mother. You're not a single mother, Mark interrupted. I've seen your husband at the house. I've seen your 2 kids. I get that you're stressed, but that's not my responsibility to solve. So you just let me strand my daughter in the cold, Karen said, and she could hear her voice shaking with rage and something else. Shame, maybe, or the desperate need to justify her own choices. Is that what kind of neighbor you are? I'm the kind of neighbor who says no, Mark said, and his voice had gone very quiet. I'm the kind of neighbor who sets boundaries, and you're not respecting them. So let me be very clear, you cannot use my charger. You will not use my charger. If you are in a genuine emergency, I will help you. But if you keep showing up here demanding things, I'm going to have to ask you to stop coming to my house. Karen stared at him. The words were meant to hurt, and they did. They landed in a place in her that was already wounded and resentful. You're a bad person, she said quietly. I hope you know that. She drove away from his house with her battery at 16%. She drove slowly and carefully, and she made it to the charging station, where she waited for an hour and 40 minutes for her car to charge while her daughter did homework in the passenger seat and kept asking if they were going home soon. That night, she didn't tell her husband exactly what had happened. She said the charger situation wasn't working out and she'd handle it herself. She sat in her car in the garage for a long time, thinking. By the next morning, something had shifted in Karen. The anger had crystallized into something harder and more purposeful. Mark wanted to play hardball with her over electricity? Fine. She had an idea. She'd seen a posting in the community Facebook group a few weeks ago about a local electrician who did free consultations. She found his number in her phone and called him on her lunch break. She explained the situation. Her neighbor had an expensive EV charger. She had a dying car. She wanted to know if there were any ways she could share the cost burden or split the use. Like, could I run an extension cord from his charger to my property? She asked innocently. The electrician had laughed. You'd need an electrician's license to do that safely, and you'd probably owe him for the electrical work, to be honest. Most folks who do that work it out with their neighbor directly. So that wasn't going to work. But the electrician's office was near a coffee shop, and she sat there after the consultation, scrolling through information about EV chargers, about electrical systems, about the intersection of technology and property. She was looking for something, a loophole, an angle, a way to solve her problem. And then she found it. It was a Reddit thread, buried in a forum for tech people and EV enthusiasts. Someone was discussing the security features on level 2 chargers, specifically the ones from Mark's manufacturer. Apparently, there was a known vulnerability where if you had physical access to the charger and you had some basic technical knowledge, you could access the admin panel through a backdoor code that the tech community had discovered and then shared. Karen didn't know if this was legal, didn't know if it qualified as hacking, didn't know what would happen if she was caught. But she knew that Mark's charger sat in his garage, with the door that locked with a standard garage door opener code, and she knew that Mark had given her that code. She knew that she was absolutely not going to do this. But she spent the rest of the week thinking about it, thinking about how Mark had humiliated her by setting a boundary, thinking about how he had essentially told her that his comfort was worth more than her daughter's safety, thinking about how he could afford to be generous and had chosen not to be. By Friday, she'd written down the backdoor code from the Reddit thread. She'd saved it in her phone with a note that just said info. She wasn't going to use it. She absolutely was not going to use it. But the fact that she could, the fact that it was possible, gave her a strange kind of power. Friday night, she was sitting at dinner with her family when her husband mentioned casually that her car had shown up on a traffic camera for speeding the previous week, and they'd be getting a ticket. It was $85. She didn't have $85. She had $47 in her checking account after she paid for gas. She excused herself to the bathroom and sat on the toilet with her phone, pulling up the Reddit thread. She read the instructions 3 times. She read the comments from people who'd successfully done this, who talked about how they'd accessed the admin panels, who discussed what was visible and what could be controlled. She didn't do anything that night, But Saturday morning early, before anyone was awake, she drove to Mark's house. The garage door opened with the code. The charger sat there, a sleek white rectangle on the wall, looking very expensive and very accessible. Her hands were shaking as she approached it. She had the code memorized. She knew the sequence of buttons to press. She was going to try this once just to see if it worked, just to verify that what she read online was accurate. If it didn't work, she'd forget about it. If it did. Her fingers hovered over the keypad. She could feel her heart rate accelerating. This was the moment where she was going to cross a line she couldn't uncross. This was the moment where resentment became action, where fantasy became crime. She pressed the code. The keypad lit up. She heard the sound of a lock disengaging, and then the charging port interface shifted into a screen she'd never seen before. An admin panel, a record of all the usage, a list of settings. She took a screenshot, then another. She didn't change anything. She didn't actually use the charger, she just took the screenshots and left. But as she was driving away, she realized something with perfect clarity. She could change the billing settings. She could access that charger and set the billing to run on her account instead of Mark's. She could charge her car for free, unlimited, and Mark would never know where the charges were coming from. The bill would come to her, but the electrical draw would be from his house, his meter, his infrastructure. She could steal from him. Not physically, not in a way that would be prosecutable as theft of property. But she could take what was his electricity, his generosity of infrastructure, his expensive charger, and use it without paying for it. And she could do it in a way that would cause him ongoing financial loss without him knowing exactly who was responsible. It was the perfect crime, if you could even call it a crime. It was the perfect justice, if you could call deliberate fraud justice. Karen drove home and didn't think about anything else all day. She picked up her kids from school. She made dinner. She helped with homework. She went through the motions of her life while her mind spiraled around the decision she was facing. By that night, she'd decided. He'd pushed her to this. He'd refused to help, had made her feel unwelcome, had set boundaries that were technically his right to set, but morally his obligation to transcend. The charger was his problem now. She was going to solve her problem using his resources. She was going to wait until he was away. Then she was going to access that charger, change the billing settings to send the charges to her account, and she was going to charge her car for free every single day until he figured it out. She pulled up her calendar and began to stalk his patterns, looking for a day when both he and Sarah were away. Mark and Sarah left for a weekend trip to visit her parents on November 15th. Karen had noted the date in her calendar 3 days prior, after seeing Sarah's post on Facebook about the drive down to her mother's house. Approximately 48 hours. Plenty of time to access the charger, change the settings, and have everything in place before Mark returned. Karen's hands were steady as she pulled into his driveway on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Steady and cold and certain in a way they hadn't been before. She'd crossed a threshold in her own mind. What she was about to do was no longer theoretical. She parked in the grass beside his driveway so her car wouldn't be immediately visible from the street. The garage door code worked exactly as it had before. She was inside in 40 seconds, the door closing behind her. The charger seemed to mock her with its sleek design, its promise of Tesla engineering and reliability. She approached it slowly, the way someone might approach something dangerous. The keypad, the code, the sequence she'd memorized from Reddit, triple-checked against 3 different sources. This time, the admin panel wasn't just to look at. This time, she navigated to the billing settings. The interface was clean, professionally designed, exactly what you'd expect from expensive technology. There were multiple options for billing configuration. The primary user, Mark. Secondary users, there were none currently, guest charging rates, and something called payment routing. Karen's heart was pounding so hard, she thought it might actually vibrate out of her chest. The payment routing settings showed everything. Mark's payment method, a business credit card ending in 2847. The current billing rate, 24 cents per kilowatt hour, plus a $1.50 connection fee, and a setting that allowed the owner to add alternative payment methods or redirect billing to a different account. She took a screenshot. Her hands were definitely shaking now. She navigated to the Add Alternative Payment Methods section and entered her name, her account number from her electric company, she had it memorized, and her checking account information. The system accepted it without question. No verification, no secondary authentication, no confirmation email. Then she changed the billing routing to direct all usage charges to her account instead of Mark's. It took approximately 90 seconds. When it was done, the charger displayed a new screen. "Welcome, Karen. Usage will be billed to your account." She took a screenshot of this too. Evidence, proof of concept, a record of her violation. She plugged in her car. The connection established smoothly. Her car showed that it was charging at full speed. According to the app on her phone, she'd reach 80% in 23 minutes. Karen went back to her car and sat in the driver's seat, watching the charging progress bar on her phone climb slowly upward. 15%, 22%, 31%. The bizarre thing was that it didn't feel the way she'd expected it to feel. She'd imagined this moment as triumphant, as righteous revenge, as a perfect solution to her problem. Instead, she felt slightly nauseated. Her stomach was doing small loops, her mind spinning through all the ways this could go wrong, all the consequences she'd somehow not fully thought through. She'd changed his charger settings. She'd redirected his billing to her account. She was literally stealing electricity from him in a way that was going to hit him in the wallet. When his electrical bill came in, it was going to be higher than it should be. And if he checked his charger settings, he'd find that someone had accessed the admin panel. Could he trace it back to her? Probably. Eventually. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. And when he did, what then? Would he press charges? Would it qualify as fraud? Would she go to jail? The car hit 60%, 65%. She could still fix this. She could unplug the car, access the charger again, and change the settings back. She could walk away and pretend this never happened. No one had seen her. No crime had been committed in the strictest sense. She could go back to her desperate, careful budgeting of her driving, her careful planning of routes and charging, her slow descent into financial ruin. Or she could do what she came here to do. The car hit 70%. She unplugged it. She approached the charger again and navigated back to the admin settings. She made sure that the billing routing was still directed to her account. She confirmed that it was. And then she did something reckless and stupid and deliberately provocative. She created a guest charging slot and named it for Karen Free Forever. It was taunting. It was asking for discovery. It was practically begging Mark to realize what had happened and to know exactly who had done it. She left his garage at 9:47 a.m. on Saturday morning with a 92% charged car, a heart full of something complicated that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite shame, and a secret that she knew she couldn't keep forever but felt absolutely certain she could keep for long enough. For long enough to solve her immediate problem, for long enough to get through the winter, for long enough to figure out something else, some other solution, some way to move past this moment where she'd become someone she'd never thought she'd be. Over the next 3 days, Karen charged her car 3 times. Each time she was terrified. Each time she told herself it would be the last time. Each time she went back again. The billing was being routed to her account, which meant that when the charges appeared on her bill, she was going to have to figure out a story to explain them. She decided she'd say it was an error, a duplicate charge that she'd have to dispute with her electric company. By then, maybe she'd have figured out something else. By then, maybe Mark would have already discovered the breach and confronted her, and then at least the secret would be out. But Mark didn't confront her. Mark came back from his trip and went about his life, apparently unaware that someone had accessed his charger and redirected its billing. Karen watched him carefully for signs of discovery, tighter expression, more formal greetings, changed behavior, but Mark seemed exactly the same as he'd always been. He went to work. He worked from home. He occasionally waved at her if they happened to cross paths. By the time Karen charged her car for the 5th time at his charger, the fear had started to feel manageable, almost routine. She was only going to charge when she absolutely needed to, she'd decided. She wasn't going to abuse the system. She was going to be responsible about it. She was just leveling the playing field. This was just Mark finally paying what he'd always owed her, access to resources that should have been shared from the beginning. She'd constructed an entire narrative where this was justified, where this was fair, where the theft was actually just correcting an injustice. By early December, when Mark's electrical bill arrived, Karen was surprisingly calm about the possibility of discovery. She'd had weeks to prepare her psychological defense. She'd had weeks to convince herself that she had a right to what she was taking. She didn't know that Mark had gone into his charger settings the morning after his bill arrived, immediately noticing the unusual usage patterns and the redirected billing. She didn't know that he'd taken screenshots, that he'd accessed his credit card company's fraud department, that he'd reported the unauthorized access to his charger as a security breach. She didn't know that he was currently sitting with his phone and a piece of paper on which he'd written down all the dates and times when unauthorized charges had occurred. She didn't know that every single one of them aligned perfectly with the times when he'd watched Corinne's car arrive in his driveway over the past month. She didn't know because he hadn't confronted her yet. He was waiting for something. He was planning something. He was, in his own quiet way, deciding exactly how he was going to respond to what she'd done. The thing about Mark was that he thought like an engineer. He thought about systems and consequences and what happened when you pulled certain levers. And he decided that he wasn't going to pull the legal lever immediately. He was going to play this differently. He was going to let her keep stealing. December arrived with extraordinary cold and a particular kind of desperation that only financial uncertainty can create. Corinne's own electric bill had increased significantly, though not as much as she'd expected given the amount of charging she'd been doing. The discrepancy made her nervous. Either the billing system was glitching, or Mark had already discovered what she'd done and was in the process of collecting evidence to hand to the police. She stopped charging at his place for 2 full weeks. She went back to her careful budgeting, her restricted routes, her anxiety about whether she'd make it home each day. It was exhausting and demoralizing and all-consuming. But then her daughter had a fever and needed to get to urgent care, and Corinne was at 11% charge, and the urgent care clinic was 20 miles away, and she found herself pulling into Mark's driveway again on a cold December Tuesday evening. She sat in the car for 5 minutes before approaching the charger. She was checking to see if Mark was home, if his car was there, if the coast was clear. His Tesla was parked in the driveway, the house lit up against the cold evening. He was home. She was about to access his charger while he was there. Her hands shook as she entered the code. The garage door opened. She pulled in and shut it behind her as quickly as possible. Her car was showing 45 minutes to full charge at this rate. 45 minutes with Mark's car just outside, with Mark presumably inside watching television or having dinner or doing any of 1,000 things that had nothing to do with the fact that she was stealing from him. She plugged in her car and headed back to the house. She could see through the garage door window into the kitchen. Mark was there, standing at the counter, making a sandwich. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open. They looked so normal, so ordinary, so completely unaware of her crime. Corinne's car reached 40% when the garage door suddenly began to open. Corinne's entire body went cold. She watched as the door rolled up and Mark stepped inside, casual as you please, carrying a beer bottle. He looked at her, at the car plugged into the charger, at the steady flow of electrons running from his infrastructure into her vehicle. "Hi, Corinne," he said, his tone friendly in a way that immediately made her understand he was not actually friendly. My daughter is sick," Corinne said immediately, the excuse forming before she could even think about what a lie it was. "I need to get to urgent care. I'm just borrowing." "I know what you're doing," Mark said, taking a drink of his beer. "I know about the charger access. I know about the billing redirect. I know about the For Corinne Free Forever guest profile." Corinne's mouth went dry. This was it. This was the moment. He was going to call the police. He was going to have her arrested. She was going to be charged with fraud and identity theft and electrical theft and about 100 other things she'd spent the last month trying not to think about too hard. "Mark, I'm sorry," she started, but he held up a hand. "Don't," he said. "Don't apologize, don't lie about why you're doing it or what you're doing or any of that. I understand your financial situation. I know your car battery is degrading. I know you're struggling. But what you did was break into my charger's security system, redirect my billing, and steal electricity from my home. That's fraud." "I know," Corinne whispered. "You know," Mark repeated. He took another drink. "Okay, so here's what's going to happen. You're not going to come back here again. You're going to stop accessing my charger. And in approximately," he looked at his phone, 37 minutes your car is going to have enough charge to get to urgent care or wherever you actually need to go." Corinne felt a spark of hope. Was he going to let her go? Was he not going to press charges? "And then," Mark continued, "I'm going to let the meter run." "What?" Corinne said. "I'm going to disconnect the billing redirect from your account," Mark said. "But I'm not going to fix my charger yet. I'm going to let you think that it's still sending the charges to you, but I'm going to reconfigure it to send the charges to me again." Every time you charge here, every time you use my electricity after tonight, you're going to think you're stealing from me. But I'm going to be the one paying for it." Karen stared at him. "I don't understand." "You will," Mark said, "because I'm going to be monitoring the charger's usage, and I'm going to be keeping a record of every charge you make, every kilowatt hour you draw from my infrastructure, and I'm going to calculate the exact cost. And then I'm going to send you a bill, a real bill, for the electricity you've already stolen plus the electricity you're about to steal." He pulled out his phone and showed her something on the screen, an app connected to his charger. It was showing real-time usage data. As they spoke, her car continued to charge, and a running total at the top of the screen climbed upward: 47 cents, 89 cents, $1.23. "Right now, you're being charged 24 cents per kilowatt hour plus the connection fee," Mark continued. "In 37 minutes, when your car is charged enough to go to urgent care, you're going to owe me approximately $8.50. After tonight, every time you come back here, I'm going to let you charge. I'm going to let you think you're committing the perfect crime, and I'm going to watch the bill accumulate." Karen started, but he cut her off. "And when the bill gets high enough, when it adds up to a number that really means something, I'm going to hand it over to my credit card company. I'm going to report it as fraud. I'm going to press charges. And then, when we're both sitting in front of a prosecutor, you'll get to explain to them why you repeatedly stole electricity from a neighbor despite being given multiple opportunities to find legitimate solutions." He walked back toward the door to the house, then turned back. "Your daughter probably should get to urgent care soon," he said. "Your car should be at 40% by now. That should get you there. And Karen," he paused in the doorway, "don't come back here again, not after tonight, I mean it." He went back inside. Karen stood in the garage, her legs feeling weak. She looked at the charger at her car still plugged in, drawing power that she'd thought was free but now understood was being carefully, deliberately, methodically cataloged and priced and saved up for a reckoning. She unplugged her car at 42% and left. The urgent care visit was real. Her daughter did have a fever, did need to see a doctor, did get prescribed antibiotics. But as Karen sat in the waiting room, she kept thinking about Mark in his garage, about the app on his phone showing the charges accumulating, about the bill he was going to send her. He wasn't actually going to let her keep charging for free. He was setting a trap, and he wanted her to know it was a trap. He wanted her to come back, thinking she was getting away with something, only to discover later that every moment of that theft was being recorded. Or what if he was bluffing? What if he'd reconfigured the charger to send charges to his account, but maybe his app wasn't actually connected properly? Maybe the charges weren't being recorded as carefully as he'd suggested. Karen realized, as she sat in that urgent care waiting room with her feverish daughter beside her, that she was already thinking about going back. That was when she understood that Mark had won, had understood exactly what he was doing. He was going to make her second-guess every decision, every access, every moment of using his charger. He was going to make her paranoid. He was going to turn her own crime into her own psychological torture. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen didn't charge at Mark's place. She made do with public chargers, with careful route planning, with the anxiety and the budgeting and the fear that came with each day. But on December 30th, 3 days before the year ended, she was at 14% with 30 miles to go, and there was a charging station offline, and Mark's charger was sitting there waiting. She pulled into his driveway and sat in her car for 15 minutes, just sitting, just staring at the garage. The worst part was that she knew it was a trap. The absolute worst part was that she was going to spring it anyway. She got out of her car and entered the code. As she plugged in, as her car began to draw power from Mark's infrastructure, she pulled up her banking app on her phone, just to check, just to see. There was a notification from her electric company. A new charge for 0.247 for usage at Mark's address. So the charges were going to her, just like she'd set them up initially. Either Mark hadn't actually reconfigured the charger, or he'd reconfigured it, and then she'd misunderstood something about how the system worked. She felt a bizarre flutter of relief, and then immediately a spike of anxiety. If the charges were coming to her, what was Mark planning? What was his trap? She unplugged her car at 80% and drove away. By January 3rd, when Mark's carefully constructed plan was about to reach its peak, Karen still didn't understand what he was actually doing. She'd charged at his place 4 more times over the holiday period. Each time she'd checked her electric bill and found the charges accumulating. Each time she'd told herself it would be the last time. Each time she'd come back anyway. And then on January 3rd, she received an email from Mark. "Corinne," it read, "I've been monitoring the charger usage and billing for the past month. According to my records, you've charged your vehicle 13 times at my charger, drawing a total of 52.4 kilowatt hours. At the current rate of 24 cents per kWh plus connection fees, the total cost is $14.67. However, I'd like to propose something different. I'm not going to press charges for the unauthorized access to my charger. I'm not going to report the fraud to my credit card company. What I am going to do is this: I'm going to let the meter run. Every time you charge at my charger from this point forward, I'm going to be documenting the usage and the cost. I'm going to let you think you're getting away with something. I'm going to let you believe that you're stealing from me in a way that doesn't have consequences. And when the bill gets high enough, when it reaches a number that's significant enough to matter, $500, let's say, I'm going to press charges. I'm going to walk into a police station with documentation of 13 months of unauthorized access and stolen electricity. I'm going to show them that despite being asked to stop, you continued to steal from me, and I'm going to have you prosecuted. Why am I telling you this instead of just doing it? Because I think you're redeemable. I think you're not actually a bad person. You're just desperate and you made a mistake. If you stop using the charger, if you stop coming to my house, I'm going to delete these records. I'm going to forget this happened. We're going to go back to being neighbors who don't particularly like each other, but who respect each other's boundaries. But if you keep coming back, if you keep thinking that your desperation justifies your theft, then I'm going to let this bill run until you understand exactly what it means to have consequences. The choice is yours, and I think you're smart enough to make the right one. Mark. Corinne read the email 4 times. The first time, she was mostly trying to understand it. The second and third times, she was looking for the angle, the trap, the trick. By the fourth time, she was sitting on her kitchen floor with her phone in her hand, and she was understanding, with the full weight of her terrible choices, exactly what Mark had done. He'd handed her agency back. He'd given her a choice. He'd made the consequences clear and certain. And he'd made it about character, your character, Corinne, your choices, your ability to see the wrong you've done and stop doing it. She looked down at her phone. Her battery was at 68%, which meant her car was still charged from the last time she'd been to his house. Her stomach twisted. What if this email was a bluff? What if he hadn't actually been documenting anything? What if she could just keep coming back and he'd never follow through? She pulled up her email draft and started to respond. Then she deleted it. Then she called his number instead. He answered on the 3rd ring. "That email was a lot," Corinne said without preamble. "Yeah," Mark said on the other end. "I wanted to be clear." "Are you actually going to press charges?" Corinne asked. There was a long pause. "I don't know yet," Mark said honestly. "That depends on what you do next." Corinne was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about her daughter asking why they were slowing down in the car. She was thinking about the urgent care visit that was actually necessary. She was thinking about Mark and Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, living their lives, not thinking about Corinne's problems. "I'm not coming back," Corinne said finally. "Okay," Mark said. "I'm sorry," Corinne added. "I know you said not to apologize, but I am. I did something wrong and I know it, and I'm sorry." "I know you are," Mark said, "and I believe you mean it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to delete those records, all of them. The unauthorized access logs, the billing documentation, all of it. I'm going to factory reset the charger to remove the For Corinne guest profile, and I'm going to accept your apology." "Why?" Corinne asked. "Because I think you learned something," Mark said. "And because, believe it or not, I remember what it's like to be desperate. Not like you, maybe, but in my own way. And because I think the best justice isn't punishment. It's just letting someone see clearly what they've done and trusting them to do better." Corinne hung up after a few more minutes of conversation. She sat in her kitchen in the dark, her car outside with its full battery, her daughter asleep upstairs, her husband watching television in the living room. The next morning, she started researching public charging options more seriously. She looked into a different electric company that offered better rates. She called the dealership and asked about battery replacement financing plans. She found a community program that helped low-income families upgrade to more efficient vehicles. For the first time in months, she was solving her actual problem instead of pretending that stealing would solve it. And 4 months later, when Mark started getting the new bills for his charger's electricity draw, which had dropped back to just his own Tesla consumption, he deleted the documentation files he'd compiled. He didn't need them anymore. Karen had made her choice. They wouldn't be friends. They wouldn't be close neighbors with a warm relationship. But they would be people who had learned something important about boundaries, about consequences, and about what happens when desperation meets entitlement, and what happens when someone gives you the chance to be better. 3 weeks after Karen's phone call, Mark received an official notice from his electric company. A review of his account had detected unusual activity on his charger during December and early January. They were offering a full refund for the unauthorized charges and conducting an investigation into potential identity theft. Mark stared at the letter for a long time. He had technically known this was coming. He had documented everything, reported the breach to his credit card company, and filed a formal complaint with the utility company. But he'd done all of this with the expectation that he would then withdraw the complaint once Karen stopped. He'd wanted to create consequences that were so clear and present that they'd feel real even if he never actually followed through on them. He called his credit card company and formally withdrew the fraud claim. The utility company couldn't fully retract their investigation. These things had to go through proper channels. But they were satisfied enough when he explained that the issue had been resolved and the breach had been contained. But Karen, sitting in her kitchen when she received her own notice from the electric company about charges to a property she didn't live at, understood exactly what had happened. Mark had reported the breach. Mark had documented everything. And Mark had then stepped back and let her make her choice knowing the full weight of what was coming if she didn't. She hadn't tested him again after that phone call. She'd been genuinely committed to finding legitimate solutions. Her car, purchased used from a dealership about an hour's drive away that was running a winter clearance sale, was now in her driveway. It was a 3-year-old Hyundai EV with a significantly better battery than her Leaf had ever had. She'd gotten a 0% financing deal because the dealership had been motivated to move inventory before the new model year. The monthly payments were real and they were substantial, but they were manageable. More manageable, at least, than the cost of perpetual desperation. The peculiar thing about consequences is that they're often invisible until you look back at them. Karen wasn't in legal trouble. She wasn't in jail. She hadn't even been formally accused of anything. Mark had dropped the complaints, and the utility company investigation had reached a quiet conclusion that suggested no actual criminal action. But she knew, and Mark knew she knew, and that knowledge was worth more than any formal consequence could have been. On a cold afternoon in late January, Karen was pulling into her driveway when she saw Mark getting his mail from the mailbox at the edge of his property. For the first time in months, they were both outside at the same time. She got out of her car slowly, deliberately, giving him the chance to go back inside if he wanted to. He didn't. He waited, leaning against the mailbox as she walked over. "Hi," Karen said. "Hi," Mark replied. "I got my bill adjusted," Karen said. "The electric company refunded all the charges. I wanted to thank you for that, for not pressing charges, for giving me the opportunity to do better." Mark nodded. "I meant what I said about being redeemable. You are." "I also wanted to tell you that my new car's battery is much better," Karen continued. "I'm not going to be desperate about charging anymore. I'm going to be able to make my own decisions about where I charge and how I live." "That's good," Mark said. "That's really good." There was an awkward silence. They weren't friends. They probably never would be friends. But there was something in the air between them now, a recognition of each other's humanity, a memory of the moment when one person had power over another and chose to use it compassionately instead of destructively. "I'm sorry," Karen said again. "I know I've said it, but I mean it. I'm sorry for violating your privacy, for stealing from you, for putting you in a position where you had to monitor me and document things. All of it." "I know you are," Mark said, "and I've accepted your apology, so we're good." Karen nodded. "We are." "We're neighbors," Mark said, "and we respect each other's property now. Beyond that, we don't have to be anything, but we can be that." As Karen walked back to her car, she felt something shift inside her. The anger was gone. The resentment was gone. What was left was a clean, clear understanding of what she'd done and what it had cost her, not in legal consequences, but in the recognition of her own capacity for dishonesty. She'd faced herself and her own justifications and found them wanting. That night at dinner, she told her family the truth. Not all of it. There were details they didn't need to know, but the essential truth. That she'd been struggling with the car situation, that she'd considered doing something wrong, and that a neighbor had reminded her that there were better ways to solve problems. Her teenage daughter, across the table, looked up from her phone. "Did you steal from him?" she asked bluntly. Karen froze. "How did you?" "I saw you leave his driveway like every other day for like a month," her daughter said. "And then you stopped. I figured something happened." "Yes," Karen said. "I did something wrong and then I stopped." Her daughter nodded slowly, taking this in. "Did he call the cops?" "No," Karen said. "He could have, but he gave me a choice instead, and I made a better one." Her husband, who had been quiet through all of this, reached across the table and put his hand on Karen's. "I'm glad," he said simply. "I'm glad you figured it out." The story that started on an autumn afternoon with a desperate ask and ended on a winter afternoon with an apology could have gone many different ways. It could have ended with Karen in legal trouble. It could have ended with Mark taking her to small claims court or to criminal court. It could have ended with neighbors angry at each other, a neighborhood fractured, a family traumatized. Instead, it ended with Karen understanding something essential about herself. That desperation, while real, doesn't justify theft. That boundaries, while sometimes inconvenient, matter. That there are always other solutions, even when the desperation is screaming that there aren't. And it ended with Mark understanding something about himself, too. That having power over someone doesn't obligate you to use it destructively. That consequences can be gentle. That compassion isn't weakness, it's strategy. It's the decision that someone can be better, and then giving them the space and the motivation to be exactly that. The meter that Mark had let run wasn't just measuring electricity. It was measuring the weight of choices, the cost of justifications, the price of the line between taking what wasn't yours and asking for what you needed. In the end, what Karen owed wasn't money. It was attention. It was the acknowledgement that her actions had ripples. It was the commitment to do better when she was given the chance. And that, as it turned out, was payment enough. By April, the story had largely faded from active memory. Karen and Mark had developed the kind of relationship that most suburban neighbors had: polite waves, the occasional conversation about weather or community association updates, a quiet respect for each other's boundaries. Karen's daughter had started asking questions about what had happened that winter, and Karen had given her honest answers. It had become, in that household, a teaching moment about ethics and consequences and the importance of finding better solutions when you're struggling. Mark had upgraded his charger that spring, installing a more expensive model with better security features. He'd thought about putting a sign on it. "This charger is monitored and secured," but decided against it. The real security wasn't in the sign. It was in the accountability. One afternoon in mid-May, Karen was pulling out of her driveway when she saw Mark and Sarah loading up their car with luggage. They were heading to the airport for a week-long trip. As Karen drove past, Mark caught her eye and raised his hand in a wave. Not a wave of distrust or suspicion, just a regular neighborly wave. Karen waved back, and as she drove toward the charging station that had become her regular place to plug in, the one 7 miles away that had reasonable rates and a quiet waiting area where she could read or work while her car charged, she realized that this ordinary moment of mutual acknowledgement, was worth infinitely more than the electricity she'd tried to steal. The real cost of her actions hadn't been measured in dollars or legal consequences. It had been measured in the moment she understood that Mark was a human being with boundaries, and that her desperation didn't erase his right to them. It had been measured in the realization that she had a choice, every single day, between taking what wasn't hers and asking for what she needed. The hardest lesson had been the simplest one, that sometimes the best solutions don't come from outsmarting people or stealing from them. They come from facing the actual problem instead of avoiding it. They come from asking for help in legitimate ways. They come from changing your circumstances instead of just resenting them. By June, Karen had paid off 3 months of her car payment, and her budget was stabilizing. She wasn't rich. She wasn't even particularly comfortable. But she was no longer in the kind of desperate place where breaking into her neighbor's charger had seemed like a reasonable solution. Mark never asked about the charges on his electricity bill. The slightly elevated usage from December and January was just an anomaly, just part of winter living in the suburbs. And if he noticed it, if he remembered the moment when Karen had been stealing from him and he'd chosen to let her steal while documenting everything with the intention of using it as leverage for her to do better, well, he kept that to himself. Some lessons are best learned quietly, in the moment between desperation and grace, between taking what you need and asking for what you deserve. And some neighbors, it turns out, understand that difference better than we ever expect them to. The meter had run, the bill had been paid, and the real cost, as it always is, had been the person you became in the process of choosing better.